Thank you, Dean Montalvan, for that promotion. I never know how I'm going to be introduced, and it's really great. It's great to be here with you today, and my co-panelist. I really have learned a lot from listening to you, so thank you for what you've shared. Actually, when there was a discussion with me about this Life of the Mind event, I was talking to our Provost Santa Ono, and I said, that really sounds like a great idea. And he said, well, are you going to be in it? And I hadn't thought that I was going to be in it, but Dean Montalvan and Professor Harknett, of course, wanted me in it, and I'm delighted to be here and be part of this event. My focus in comparison to the other two speakers, as you might guess, is going to be on race as a biracial American man. My comments also, as many of you have heard me talk before, are going to be very personal. More than academic, because I do like to talk about the lived experience. I like to look at the real world implications and the impact on individuals and how their lives are lived or controlled by ways that they're identified. And sometimes I think as academics we just count heads and we don't count people. And so I like to count the people. And I hope to be able to weave some of the comments of my co-panelists into some of the things that I'm going to say today. The title of my presentation uses the word uncertainty. Now, some of you may wonder why I chose the word uncertainty, but I chose it because identity has been an issue in my family spanning 3 centuries, over 175 years. As I've looked at my family history and what I thought were issues that I was facing alone when I was growing up, as I looked more and more at my family, were issues actually that my father faced, my grandmother faced, my great-grandfather faced, and ancestors before us faced as well. America, like and unlike many other countries, has always wanted to classify people, and particularly with regard to race in this country, we have had what they've called the one-drop rule. Many of you have heard about the one-drop rule. Actually, the one-drop rule has been embedded in state statutes and the way we think and the way we've approached the division among races in this country, particularly African Americans. And I remember reading through state legislative documents and seeing how this one-drop rule was embedded. And this is something that lasted well over 150 years. And in fact, it wasn't until 1966 in the Supreme Court case that went to the United States that Virginia's anti-miscegenation law was overruled in the case, ironically, of Loving versus Virginia, where an interracial couple had married against the laws of the state of Virginia and took that to the Supreme Court of the United States. So the one-drop rule was really part of the laws of this country for well over 150 years. And lest one think that it was just southern states, my home state of Indiana also embedded the one-drop rule in its legislation. And it's interesting how they did that. There was such a desire to classify, they started out saying, well, if you're 3/4 black, then you're considered black. And then they go down 3/4, 50%, 25%, and ended up any quantum whatsoever, i.e. the one-drop rule. That's the world that I grew up in. Uncertainty, of course, surrounding my racial identity has been directly addressed, as I understand it, last graduation, in a June graduation, a June commencement. Some members of the audience and maybe even some of the graduates, as opposed to listening to the speakers, were tweeting, and one of them said, well, whoever said that UC's president is black was sadly mistaken. More bluntly, one stated, he's as white as day, LOL. These kind of remarks may in some way show how times have changed since my life turned upside down over 5 decades ago. The moment that my father confessed to me that he was not Greek, as he had told me, that he was not Italian, as he had told me, he in fact was black and had been passing for white, or in those days we called Negro or colored. In 1960, if there was any implication that a person was any part black whatsoever, there was no question about that because there was a social stigma associated with it. Today, maybe if you don't fit exactly the stereotype of what African Americans could look like, people will raise that question. My transition from white to black, and I know Laura's done a lot of work on this, was quick, it was abrupt, and it was painful, and I was only 10 years old. Getting off on a bus in Washington, D.C. as a white boy after my family disintegrated, going back to Muncie, Indiana, walking off that bus 18 hours later as a black boy, and my life changed forever. At first, I was not accepted by blacks or whites, and I had a lot of cuts and bruises on the school playgrounds and other places. But eventually, the black community was more accepting, and it's that community that I found love, support, and concern, because that community understood there was a real pantheon of colors and people and culture and backgrounds that really made up the race, if you will. And that fact, of course, was important to me because the racial lines were very rigid in my hometown. It was important also because it was difficult for people to deal with that, because my presence defied the conventional wisdom of who is black or not. I didn't fit neatly into any category that people would like to put me in, as they did in those days. Actually, and I remember this happened to me many times, and I remember even once when I was in the 9th grade, I think around 1959, maybe in the middle of the basketball season, and I had a note to go see my guidance counselor. And so I went down to talk to my guidance counselor. It was the first and last time I ever talked to her or any other guidance counselor when I was in school. Actually, her name was Miss White, and I didn't make that name up. Actually, that was her name, Miss White. So Miss White had heard that I had been seen talking to some white girls in the hallway, even before or after basketball games, and she wanted to tell me that that was really unacceptable for me to be talking to white girls in 1959 in Muncie, Indiana. And actually, that what I should do when I headed to the high school the next year, I should talk to all of my teachers and tell them about my problem of not fitting neatly into any categories, although she didn't add that, so that they can help guide me to make sure that I did not cross those lines that had been established in my hometown. Needless to say, I did not follow Miss White's instructions, but there were still a lot of people that paid attention to me and what I was doing. Even today, I know that my identity can be confusing to people because I do not look stereotypically African American, and oftentimes when I walk into the room, people say, well, where's the black guy? Many armchair sociologists maintain that race is all about skin color, not culture, heritage, family, or lived experiences. And again, I defy the typical, stereotypical approach. While working on my second book of following my memoir, I've learned that this uncertainty, as I said earlier, has followed my family for generations. The earliest ancestor that I've been able to trace in my family actually was listed as a piece of property in slave records I discovered in Amherst County, Virginia in 1834. Actually, it didn't even have his name. There was absolutely no attempt to humanize him. He just had an M for mulatto, again, mixed race, in 1834. He was listed just like all the other property that was listed there by the slave owners. Even later, on the census records, I would see members of my family listed as property. In fact, the family that owned my family were the Higginbottoms. And I remember once reading a little bit about the Higginbottoms, and actually they had something like real property worth $500. Their personal property, i.e. the slaves, was $1,800. So my family, my ancestors, constituted the bulk of the wealth of the Higginbottom family. Each of my ancestors had different ways of dealing with this racial middle ground, if you will. There's even some discussion in my family tree of Native American heritage, which leads me to speculate, as Laura kind of indicated, that maybe the Native American ancestry was turned to in some way to try to elevate our status. And I've seen that happen before. Actually, I've also heard of Native Americans attempting to elevate their status. I remember when I was a professor at the University of Iowa. I was also the chair of the Iowa Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and we went down to visit the Meskwaki Indian settlement in Iowa and to deal with some issues. And then as I got a chance to know the people in the settlement, I found, well, there was a kind of a chatter that was going around that settlement down there among the families, and there was some division, some really harsh division on some of these issues. And the major issue they were concerned about is which family had the best ability to trace their lineage back to the white Frenchmen who founded the settlement. Again, trying to elevate his status. As a kid, I remember stories about my great-grandfather, Shan Higginbottom, who wore his hair actually in long braids, always under his hat, and he carried himself like a Native American, and apparently talked about the Native American ancestry. But I've looked, and I've been unable to discover that to this point. Now, my great-grandfather, Shan Higginbottom, was 9 years old and a slave in Kentucky when the Emancipation Proclamation was written and announced. And actually, he still was a slave after the Emancipation Proclamation, because many of you may not know, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed those in states in which were still in rebellion against the Union. It was not until the passage of the 14th Amendment that all the slaves in the United States were freed, and my grandfather, great-grandfather, was about 10 years old. By that time, he became a farm worker and worked on a farm. Actually, on the way to the Liberty Bowl in December, my son Zach and I were driving through Kentucky, and so we stopped in our ancestral home in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and walked up and down the street. My great-grandfather had 13 children, including my grandmother, Sally Higginbottom, who was born around 1890. And we walked up and down the streets and trying to figure out, how did he create a life for himself and his 13 children that he had there? What was that like? Knowing the things that I knew about the family stories, what I had one of my great uncles who was tied to the railroad track and run over by a train. Race was implicated. Or when they would travel on the train, they always had to make sure they were in the segregated rail car, which of course was the worst. No heat, not ventilated. What that life is like, particularly for a guy, and also my great aunts and uncles who never learned to read or write. Now, some of them did, and that's a whole other story. That racial climate led to my black grandmother fleeing Bowling Green, Kentucky around 1916 with my dad, mixed race himself. Now, my father was a light-skinned black man who had actually an insatiable desire for education. In fact, he hitchhiked 650 miles from Muncie, Indiana to Washington, D.C. to go to Howard University. I won't ask how many of you hitchhiked to come here to the University of Cincinnati, but that is a desire to have an education. And Howard University, historically black university, was really, as they said, the capstone of Negro education in the United States, as that was characterized at that time. But even at a historically black college, my father faced hardship because he was not considered dark enough. In the black community, there have all been all kinds of classifications that take place based on skin tone. Now, the Black Power movement in the 1960s changed that to a certain extent, but not totally. In fact, I visited some campuses in this country when I went around the country doing book readings, and still talk to me about African American fraternities and sororities who make decisions as to who can join based on skin color. At Howard, my father came under the wings of Dr. Elaine Locke, who was Harvard University graduate and actually was the first black Rhodes Scholar in the United States, and played a role in what many of you may be familiar with is called the Harlem Renaissance. Dr. Locke and Ralph Bunche, who later became Undersecretary of the United Nations, were my dad's teachers, and they tried to help him negotiate that tough issue of fitting in, even at Howard University, because they realized that he did face challenges about his identity and who he was, and he's going to face challenges later on in the world. But the racial uncertainty at Howard and elsewhere was difficult for him. And interestingly enough, we never talked about that. I only discovered that later on when I talked to some of his contemporaries. It was nothing that he ever shared with me. It's something that he kept in himself. So he decided that ultimately life was going to be better if he was white. And this issue of passing, some of you may not be familiar with it, but I know if you understand the black community, many of you know passing was something that did happen on a fairly regular basis. He felt that his life would be better if he just disappeared in the white world, severing ties with his family and his friends and others that he had known. Actually, I have a copy of a letter from Dr. Locke to my father in my office that apparently was written after my dad had told Dr. Locke that he was going to pass for white, that it was too hard to survive at Howard and try to do the things he wanted to do. And Locke wrote back to him and said, "Do write here and tell me the news. I hope you successfully crossed the line just the same." And he continues, "It makes me feel a little more distant, but I am still, as always, your sincere friend and wish you, as ever, all success and happiness." Now, as I said, this is a story that was often repeated in black families across this country, where lighter members are folks who could pass for white and wanted to take advantage of economic opportunities to provide for the family did in fact do this. So this is really very much a part of the African diaspora in this country. Now, I can't say for certain how much that decision to lie about his identity contributed to my dad's alcoholism, but I think that it did. At Howard, he actually, the year he was there, he won a varsity letter in boxing and was clean liver. But then he spent almost a decade as passing as a white man. Once that charade was over, though, my life changed dramatically. And unlike many cases of shifting identity, as Laura knows, my status was not elevated. It was diminished in a very significant way. It was just the opposite, like it is for many black Americans in this country at that time and still many later. You know, oftentimes folks ask to me, is there an advantage to being black? And if I talk to whites, they generally think there is an advantage. If I talk to blacks, they say there's no advantage in being black in this country, even today, with the things we have. Given that Stefan talked about music, actually I was thinking about that when I was putting this talk together. And of course, obviously with the change in my racial identity, there was a change in music and what kind of music was important to me. I mean, I remember in the tavern my dad had, we used to listen to Perry Como and Frank Sinatra and Goji Grant and all the others. But once we had made that transition to the black community, then, of course, it was Jackie Wilson, Jerry Butler, and the Shirelles. But what was really interesting about that, actually, as Stefan has pointed out, is that music really gave us strength and drew us together as a community, a shared experience, if you will, which was very important as we were going through and dealing with a lot of the racism and issues that we had dealt with growing up. Now, some people have asked me, well, why didn't, in fact, I've had people, book readings in other places, well, why didn't you just pass for white? You look white anyway. If I had ever learned anything from my father's charade, it was that it basically destroyed him. And I decided that I was never going to do that, even though, in many respects, it has made my life more difficult. Because I felt to do so and make that transition would make me feel hypocritical, like I was turning my back on the few people who did reach out to help Greg Williams at a time there was a price to pay for helping Greg Williams. So have we reached the point where identity is irrelevant in this country and classification is no longer based on race and no longer matters? I wish I could say it did, but this was brought to me very vividly a couple weeks ago, and no doubt many of you have heard about the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old black teenager in Sanford, Florida, who was shot by a guy who was on citizen patrol. You know, I'd like you to think about, would George Zimmerman, the guy who shot Trayvon Martin, have done had he seen a white teenager in a hoodie ambling through the neighborhood? Well, my guess, and it's just my view, he probably thought, well, you know, this is a kid who has no direction. What the hell is he doing out this late at night? He is not going to follow him with a gun. Actually, Leonard Pitts, a syndicated columnist, has been following this case and was criticized for saying that the shooter, George Zimmerman, who is Hispanic, was white. Pitts reasons that Hispanic is not a race, it is an ethnicity, and there are many white Hispanics. Again, uncertainty. Pitt further argues that race is a term that is both meaningful, yet it is profoundly meaningless. He goes on, he said, it is meaningful in the sense that it provides a tool for tribalism and a means by which to organize our biases, our fears, observations, social challenges, and Sunday cultural products. It is meaningless in the sense that, well, it has no meaning. There exists no definition of what is black or white that carries any degree of scientific precision. Pitt says we are taught to believe the opposite, that black and white are immutable. And then he cites me, thank you very much, Mr. Pitts, and Walter White, the blue-eyed, blonde-haired director, former director of the NAACP, as strong and incontrovertible evidence of the meaninglessness of the distinction between black and white. He then goes on to say race is a fraud, a cruel and stupid fraud. Black is something imposed upon the slaves kidnapped from their homes in Africa, not an identity that they chose. And he concludes, white then is not simply color, but it is privilege. Not necessarily in the sense of wealth, but rather in the sense of having one's personhood and individuality respected. A privilege so basic that I doubt it registers with many whites as privilege at all. Thank you very much.